Alright, so let's talk about gradients. The idea is pretty simple. If I select something like this box, I have the size of my screen in Adobe XD, and I go to Fill, instead of it being a solid color, I can choose gradient, and there are linear gradients and radial gradients. It's basically going from the first color stop of red to a darker color stop of darker red. If I decide to change any of those, I get that gradient basically moving through those colors happening. If I choose to switch to a radial gradient, it does some really wacky stuff, but you can actually use it to your advantage if you just kind of tweak it a bit and maybe don't make it as harsh. Like if I went from maybe a gray and a lighter gray, I could do some interesting stuff there. I'm actually going to show you some tools that do a better job of that, but that's pretty the basic idea of it. And a couple of words I said there are going to be really essential to working with gradients, and that is being subtle. As you're using gradients, if you just pick any random color, you're going to get some wacky transitions. You're going to get some weird stuff because you can put basically a color stop anywhere. And I'm just going to kind of shift. This is not too bad. It's kind of subtle, but if I just start shoving colors into any place, and every time I click and add a color stop, I can just get terrible looking things that are actually very distracting. So the idea behind it is be subtle. If you want to remove a color stop in Adobe XD, you just pull on that little circle and it comes right off, and you can keep that nice and subtle. If you want to adjust where the angle's happening with that gradient, you can go from top to bottom to maybe to a corner. You can angle it like that, or even angle it sideways. You could actually even pull it in and make it really more subtle. And I'm actually going to change that color because it's like blinding my retinas. And I can make that way more subtle, or even fade from a white to another color. So it's pretty cool that with a little bit of playing around with it, you can create some nice looking stuff that doesn't feel so harsh when you are looking at it. And you'll notice too that when I pick my colors, I'll try to pick something and then leave where it's at as far as brightness and saturation, and then just work with my hues to find that color I'm looking for. Adobe XD's color pickers for gradients are pretty straightforward. That's really the main controls there is you click on a color stop to change what color it is. There actually is an eyedropper, so if you wanted to eyedrop, say, this gray and pull your color from there, or eyedrop maybe down to the chrome colors or whatever that is, like I can do that pretty easily. However, there are other tools that you can use to create UI that actually do gradients a little either differently or just better in some ways. One of my favorite ones is the application called Sketch. It works very similarly, especially if you've used any of Apple's applications. It has very similar menu controls. But what I like is when you choose a gradient, not only, and I'm going to go to my fills here on the side, when I choose gradient, not only are some of the defaults pretty nice looking, it actually does a subtle job. Like if I choose a radial gradient, notice that the radial it chooses is actually really smooth. Some of the ones that are built into the application are actually some nice looking, really simple gradients. And this isn't a tool that lets you choose an angular gradient, which you can see here kind of gives you that strong point that you've probably seen in a few designs. So pretty cool. What I also like about this is if I choose to make a gradient here, like make a shape with that gradient, I can copy and paste it over into another tool that I'm working at, or even export out the graphic that I might need to work with. Another tool that you might choose to use is Figma, making gradients there. Same idea. I click on my fill, choose linear gradient, and right now it looks like it's chosen. Oh, I am selecting my background. Let me make sure I'm selecting my rectangle instead. There we go. Linear gradient. Oh, looks like it's still using. There we go. We'll use a color. It's not so harsh. I can choose there. When you're working with the gradient, something else you can do is right now the opacity, how much transparency is happening, is all the way down to 0. So that's pretty cool. Like if I had, say I have a gradient that is a little bit darker and I want to put a shape in front of it, if I lower that opacity of whatever shape it is that I put in front, that's actually going to let it be see-through. So we know that if I was right here to change the opacity to something like 50, I can see halfway through. That works all the way for gradients as well. So if I click on this fill, say make it a linear gradient, notice that that opacity is allowing that to come through. So it's pretty cool. You can do some neat things with that if you play with that. The fact that things are kind of overlaying on top of another. You will see people do gradients on top of gradients, and they kind of blend things in to accomplish some really neat ideas. Something I really dig about the way that Figma does their gradients is you can do linear, you can do radial. Again, the radials, you have to play with the controls. You have to move out where that radial is happening. But they also let you do angular gradients And you can do a diamond gradient, which is all kinds of fun. And really the idea with these is you'll want to play with them to figure out how is this even going to be useful for a design that I'm working on. It really does take getting comfortable with the tools and knowing when to use them. Another tool that I like to use for gradients is Illustrator. That's one of the first ones I'd ever use for this. This is more of a graphic design tool, illustration tool. So the gradient, the power you have with this is way stronger. It's not meant just for UI. So yes, you can make default linear gradients, you can make radial gradients, and actually when you make a gradient here, if I grab my gradient tool, you have way more control where I can actually choose to draw that out. You can see here that I can actually see my controls as they're happening and have way more control of what's going on. But in addition to those, you actually have this other gradient, which is called a freeform gradient. And what's cool about that is it's basically like life if you saw light pushing in lots of different ways. So I can choose each of these stops over here on my freeform gradient and choose a color for it. And you can see I'm just going to pick some colors here that might work together. It's actually blending those over. And I know you've seen this design because it was really popular not that long ago for a lot of people to use in, like for designing for iPhone promotions or phone promotions. It had this kind of really cool freeform gradient. And if you click on those stops, and let me choose my gradient tool again, I can actually click on this and increase, either change the placement of it so you can see how much it pushes the other colors around, or I can increase the size of this so that it kind of have more control over that. Really cool. It's a different feel than what we saw before, but definitely really cool for depending on what you're doing with it. Here's my recommendation when you're working with gradients. Play around, that is so valuable, be subtle, and then if you're not sure what to do when you're working on them, get some good ideas. So some of the ones I like to use, there are a couple of really great tools. There's a site called uigradients.com that is just a lot of gradients. So if you have a particular color that you're trying to make a gradient out of and you're not sure, they've got some great visuals here. Like if I want a green gradient but I don't know how to get something that looks nice, not only can I click on it and it'll give me the CSS code for it, it actually just gives me the hexadecimal values, which I can copy and paste those into any of the tools I just showed you. So a really great selection. It's broken down by color. You can sort through, and like I said, it also provides, if you want, the CSS code to actually implement this onto a page if that's what you're working with. Another one I really dig is called webgradients.com, and it just has really lovely and subtle gradients. There's some really smooth things happening here. Again, there is CSS, so you can grab that, but more importantly, there are hexadecimal values, so you can copy through these. If you actually start browsing the internet and start looking for UI kits or free gradients and name the tool, whether it's Sketch or Illustrator or Adobe XD, you'll actually find that people have wonderful collections of just an entire sheet of this. It basically looks very similar to this, where here are a bunch of gradients where you can drag then drop them into your tool. I also wanted to show in Adobe XD a tool that I really love, a plugin. It is called Color Spark. It actually has a capability. It says generate gradient, and there's a keyboard shortcut for it. If I press that, it'll just give me a new gradient. And every time I press the keyboard shortcut, it'll drop in a brand new gradient. So, and if you wanted one that you passed up, you can just hit Command Z and it'll go back. And this allows you to, if you're not right now feel solid, feel comfortable making your own gradients, but maybe you know what good ones look like, you can kind of just browse until you get something auto-generated that looks pretty cool and leave it at that. I also would recommend that you take time to look at gradients out in the wild and see where they're using them. You can see from this UI kit here, this is actually a cool resource, a free resource you can download from Sketch App Resources. But notice how subtle these gradients are in these buttons. There are some harsh versions, even like looking through Google in my screen here, you can see it can get really intense. But if you make it nice and subtle, you can add some great quality to what you're doing on your UI. This one also I really dig as well. This is on Pinterest, but you can see how they use that gradient in the top of that right screen, where it just makes it really smooth kind of coming through. And then this one right here, this is a bit intense because it is doing it something visual with the illustrations, but notice how subtle that gradient is from the white faded down into this pink, a little bit of purple in there. They spent some time tweaking this, and they actually notice how they're also using some great shadows here that are blending into it, but really it does a great job of affecting this really calming and soft design. Gradients can be really powerful. Definitely takes practice to get to a spot that feels really strong, but it is not impossible. It is definitely something you can achieve. Like I said, get some good ideas in there and really have fun, play around with it. I think you'll be able to make some cool looking stuff.